The rain had been falling since late afternoon. Steady, patient, the kind that soaks the world in silence. Filled the gutters, whispered through the leaves and made the whole street shimmer beneath the dull glow of street lights. I had been sitting by the window, with a mug of half-cold tea watching droplets chase each other down the glass, pretending I wasn't lonely. Had been 3 weeks since I moved here. 3 weeks since I unpacked half my boxes and left the rest stacked in corners, waiting for a future I wasn't sure I wanted to decorate for. The house was small, barely enough space for a dining table and a couch. The fridge hummed in. The kitchen mostly empty except for milk, eggs, and a jar of pickles I didn't remember buying. After my last relationship ended, I told myself a new start would be healthy. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I didn't know the sound of anyone's laughter but my own. But silence, I've learned, can be cruel company. So when the knock came, I jumped. It wasn't loud, just 3 gentle taps. But in that stillness, it sounded like a rescue. I hesitated before opening the door. Through the frosted glass, I saw a blur of motion. Man standing beneath the porch light, rain dripping from his hair and shoulders. When I opened the door, the smell of wet pavement and earth came rushing in. "Hey," he said, breathless, but smiling. "Sorry to bother you. I live next door. I was wondering if you had any sugar. My wife's baking and we just ran out." He held out a small empty cup, an actual coffee mug with a chipped rim and the faded logo of a hardware store. The rain had dampened his shirt enough to cling to his chest, and water dripped from his jawline when he brushed a hand through his hair. For a second, I forgot to answer. "Sugar?" he prompted, his voice warm and almost apologetic. "Yeah, of course," I said, quickly stepping aside. "Come in before you drown." He laughed, that kind of low, effortless laugh that fills a room without trying. Inside, I went straight for the cabinet, reaching for the jar that hadn't been touched since I moved. "You can just take it," I said, handing him the whole jar. "I don't really bake." He smiled again, that easy, disarming kind of smile that makes you feel seen. "That's kind of you, but I just need a cup or two." He hesitated, then added, "Mind if I wait here a minute? It's coming down hard." "Not at all," I said. "Want some coffee?" "Coffee? At this hour? Sure, why not?" he said, chuckling as he placed the cup on the counter. While the coffee brewed, I tried not to stare. He was probably early 40s, strong shoulders, sun-kissed skin, the faint trace of stubble along his jaw. His hands were rough, the kind you only get from real work, gardening, maybe, or fixing things around the house. When he rubbed his palms together to warm them, I caught a glimpse of a gold ring. Simple, worn, non-nonsense. Shouldn't have noticed how it gleamed under the kitchen light. He looked around the kitchen, taking it in. "You just moved in, huh?" 3 weeks ago. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, leaning against the counter. Michael. We live just over the fence. The gray house with the maple tree." "Nice to meet you, Michael. I'm Aaron." He nodded, eyes drifting to the window. The rain was relentless now, bouncing off the glass like tiny fingers. "Feels like it's never going to stop," he murmured. "Yeah," I said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "But I kind of like nights like this. Makes everything feel slower." He took the mug, his fingers brushing mine. Just a brief, innocent touch, but enough to send a small jolt through me. "You sound like my wife," he said, grinning. "She says rain makes her nostalgic. I just think it ruins my plans to mow the lawn." I smiled back, trying to seem casual even as I studied him quietly. There was a softness in his eyes that didn't quite match his teasing tone. Something tired, something gentle. "So what do you do, Aaron?" "I write," I said. "Mostly freelance stuff. Articles, short fiction, whatever pays the bills." He raised an eyebrow. "Writer that explains the quiet house. My wife says I go crazy alone." "Might be halfway there," I said, half joking. He laughed again, an easy, warm sound that filled the kitchen. For a moment it didn't feel like I was talking to a stranger. He told me about his job managing a hardware store, about how he and his wife moved here years ago because it was a good place to settle. The way he said it, settle, carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Do you like it? Here, I asked. He took a sip of his coffee, thinking. It's quiet, predictable. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes he trailed off, glancing toward the window. Sometimes it's too quiet. Something in the way he said it made my chest tighten. Outside, the wind picked up. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied. I felt oddly aware of everything. The steady drip of water from his hair onto the tile, the faint smell of his aftershave, the warmth of the coffee between us. We talked for another 10 minutes, maybe 15, about small things, movies, local diners, the best time to mow the lawn before the sun. Ordinary talk that somehow felt extraordinary because of how easy it was. At one point, I caught him studying a framed photo on my counter, a shot of the ocean from a trip years ago. Travel much? He asked. Not lately, I said. Used to? These days it's just me and my car. Kind of lost the taste for airports. He nodded like he understood that better than I meant him to. The rain began to lighten, turning from a roar to a whisper. Michael set his mug down, glancing toward the door. Guess I should get back before my wife wonders what happened to me. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. Thanks for the sugar and the coffee, he said. I'll return the favor. Sometime. Anytime, I replied, and meant it. He hesitated for a second, as if he wanted to say something more, then simply nodded and stepped out into the soft drizzle. I watched him walk across the yard, his shoulders disappearing into the fading rain, the faint glimmer of his ring catching the last of the porch light. When I closed the door, the silence returned, but it felt different. No, not empty, charged. I washed the mugs, wiped the counter, then stood by the window again. The rain had stopped. The street was quiet, but in the stillness my pulse still beat with something restless, something new. Through the thin curtain I could just make out the outline of Michael's house, the faint glow from a kitchen window, the shadow of movement inside. I told myself not to think about him, that it was nothing, just a neighbor, just a borrowed cup of sugar. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Even in that brief moment, I didn't know then he wouldn't just borrow sugar. He'd borrow time I couldn't give. But a few mornings passed before I saw him again. The rain had gone, leaving the air thick and green, the kind that smelled of damp soil and grass freshly cut by someone with too much free time. I was watering the tiny garden that came with the house, a few stubborn tomato plants, 2 dying ferns, when I heard his voice from over the fence. Morning, writer man, Michael called, cheerful and teasing. I turned, startled, but smiled. He was standing on the other side, holding a mug, hair slightly messy, t-shirt clinging from the humidity. The sight of him felt like sunlight I didn't know I missed. Morning, I said. No sugar emergencies today, he laughed. Not yet, but I've got coffee this time. Want some? Shook my head, already on my second cup. He leaned on the fence, arms folded casually, like someone who belonged there. You settling in okay? I nodded, trying to still figuring out which grocery store doesn't overcharge for bread. He chuckled softly, sipping his coffee. You'll get used to it. This neighborhood's quiet, sometimes too quiet. I noticed then how his eyes wandered, not aimlessly but searching. He looked toward his house, toward a window on the upper floor. His phone buzzed in his hand and he glanced down, then quickly flipped it face down on the fence. His smile came a beat too late. Didn't ask. We kept talking small things, weather, local shops, the neighbor's loud dog that barked at everything but burglars. He told me he managed a hardware store in town, that he liked working with his hands more than sitting behind a desk. I told him I wrote for a living, though lately it felt more like writing to stay sane. Maybe you'll write about this place, he said. Quiet neighborhoods have stories too. Maybe, I said, but most of them don't knock for sugar at night. He laughed, an easy, genuine laugh that made the air feel lighter. That became our rhythm. Days bled into weeks, and soon our conversations became part of the landscape. The creak of the back gate, the rattle of my watering can, and Michael's voice drifting across the fence. Sometimes he'd hand me a cup of coffee. Other times I'd pass him a spare nail or screwdriver when he was fixing something in the yard. The fence felt less like a boundary and more like bridge, but there were moments, small cracks where the mood would shift. He'd glance at his phone conversation, his brow furrowed for a heartbeat before smoothing back into that familiar smile. Once when I joked that he seemed busy, he shrugged and said, "Just life. You know how it is." Did not really, but I nodded anyway. One Saturday afternoon I was on a ladder trying and failing to fix a loose gutter when Michael appeared, hands in his pockets. "You're going to break your neck," he said, looking up at me. "Fine," I said, wobbling slightly for emphasis. He shook his head. "Here, hold on." Before I could argue, he took the ladder from me, steady and confident, climbing up like he'd done this 1,000 times. I handed him a screwdriver, watching the muscles in his forearms tighten as he worked. The ring on his finger caught the sunlight again. "There," he said after a few minutes, climbing down. "You just needed to resecure the bracket. Guess I owe you one," I said. He smiled. "I'll take payment and lemonade. It's too hot for anything else." We went inside. I poured 2 glasses and handed him one. We sat by the open window, the soft buzz of summer in the air. "You always this helpful with your neighbors?" I asked. "Only the ones who look like they're about to fall off ladders," he said, smirking. He took a sip, then sighed. "You know, sometimes I forget what it's like to just sit and do nothing. No errands, no arguments, no schedule, just this." His voice carried something unspoken. Fatigue, maybe the kind that doesn't come from work. I studied him, quietly wondering what his wife was like. He mentioned her sometimes, always in passing. Her garden, her family, the bakery she loved, but never in a way that felt alive. "You okay?" I asked, careful not to sound intrusive. He looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Yeah, just thinking. She and we've been married a long time." He paused, turning the glass in his hands. "People change. Or maybe we just stopped seeing each other. You know, I didn't know what to say, so I stayed quiet." The air between us grew heavy, filled with the hum of distant cicadas and the faint sound of sprinklers somewhere down the block. He looked out the window, lost in thought. "She doesn't look at me the same anymore," he said finally. "I can't blame her. I'm not who I was when we met." I wanted to ask who he was now, but the question felt too intimate, too dangerous. Instead, I said softly, "For what it's worth, you seem like a good man." He looked at me, then really looked, and for a fleeting moment I felt like he wanted to believe it. He smiled, small but real. "Thanks. Not sure I hear that much these days." After he left, I found myself thinking about that look. The kind of gaze that lingers in your mind long after it's gone. The days that followed blurred into a gentle routine. Morning coffee by the fence. Afternoon chatter about meaningless things that somehow meant everything. Sometimes he'd borrow tools. Sometimes he'd just wander over under the excuse of checking on the tomatoes. We both knew it wasn't really about the tomatoes. In the evenings I'd hear faint sounds from his house. Voices raised, then muffled, the clatter of dishes. I pretended not to notice, though every sound seemed to echo through the fence into my chest. Then, one evening, the air turned golden and I found him sitting on his porch steps, staring at the sunset. I walked over, leaning on the fence. "You look like a man solving the universe." He smiled, weakly, just trying to remember what it felt like before everything got complicated. I sat down on my side of the fence, mirroring him. The air was warm, painted orange and pink by the dying sun. He said quietly, "Sometimes I just come out here to remember I still exist." The line hit harder than I expected. There was no self-pity in his voice, just quiet truth. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the light fade. The only sound was the rustle of leaves and the soft creak of wood as he shifted beside me. "I used to think love fixed everything," he said, eventually. "Now I think it just shows you where you're broken." I looked at him, wanting to say something, anything, but words felt clumsy, so I stayed still. The porch light flickered on. He looked up, smiled softly, and said, "Guess I should head in. Long day tomorrow." He stood, brushing off his Jins. Good night, Aaron. Good night, Michael. He lingered for a second like he wanted to add something, then turned and disappeared into the shadows of his yard. I stayed where I was long after he'd gone. The night air had cooled, but warmth still clung to the fence like it remembered his presence. That evening I realized how easily a quiet friendship could become something more. A tether, invisible but undeniable. I told myself it was harmless, just two neighbors talking, just someone to fill the silence. But deep down I knew better, because for the first time in years I felt seen, even if only across a fence, even if I was just a secret he didn't yet know he was keeping. The rain started like a whisper against the windows, the kind that felt harmless at first. By nightfall it had turned fierce, pounding on the roof like fists trying to get in. The wind howled through the cracks around the door, rattling the blinds, making the whole house groan as if the walls themselves were cold. I've been sitting on the couch, laptop open, pretending to write. The cursor blinked on a blank page. Steady, patient, accusing. Words wouldn't come. They never did on nights like this. Nights that reminded me of what loneliness sounded like. A flash of lightning lit the living room white. One beat later, thunder cracked so loudly it felt like the sky had split in two. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. For a few seconds there was just silence, not the gentle kind, the kind that feels alive. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and sighed. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, almost lost under the sound of the rain. I hesitated. At this hour, nearly midnight, it could only be one person. When I opened the door, Michael stood there, drenched, hair plastered to his forehead, shirt clinging to his chest. He looked like he'd walked straight out of the storm. Power's out. Next door, he said, voice breathless. Mind if I waited out here? For a moment, neither of us moved. Rainwater dripped from his sleeve onto the floor. His eyes searched mine, half apologetic, half desperate. Of course, I said, stepping aside. Get in before you freeze. He entered with a shiver, rubbing his arms. I grabbed a towel from the hallway closet and handed it to him. Thanks, he muttered, drying his hair. Then his face. The power outage had turned the world into shadows and outlines. The only light came from my phone's glow, bouncing weakly off the walls. I found a few candles in a drawer, leftovers from the move, and lit them one by one. Their soft glow filled the room, gold and trembling. Michael's face looked different in candlelight, softer, more honest somehow. Do you want a dry shirt? I asked. He shook his head. I'm fine. Just needed to get out for a bit. Everything went dark and he trailed off, eyes darting toward the window. Didn't want to sit there alone. Something in his voice made me pause. Your wife home? He hesitated. She's at her sister's for the week. That explained the quiet and the weight in his tone. I nodded slowly. Then you're welcome to stay until the power's back. We sat down on the couch. The rain had turned relentless, hammering the roof like it was trying to drown the world. Lightning flared outside, bleaching the room for a second, followed by thunder that shook the walls. He leaned back, eyes half closed, towel draped across his shoulders. You ever notice how storms make everything feel smaller? He said quietly, like the world's folding in on itself. I know what you mean, I said. They make you aware of what's missing. He looked at me then, a long, searching glance that felt heavier than it should have. After a few minutes, I made coffee, more for something to do than for comfort. The candle light flickered across his face as he watched the steam rise from his cup. It's funny, he said softly. When you live with someone long enough, you stop talking. You start communicating through silence. What's missing in the fridge? What isn't folded? What's left unsaid? I didn't interrupt. He wasn't really talking to me. He was talking into the dark. I used to think marriage meant safety, he went. Now it just feels like invisibility. I walk through my own house and it's like I'm not there. Like I'm just an echo bouncing off the walls. I didn't know what to say to that, but I understood it too well. I get it, I finally said. Silence can feel heavier than shouting. At least shouting means someone still cares enough to make noise. He laughed, quiet and bitter. Yeah, I guess you could say I miss being yelled at. The thunder rolled again, shaking the windows. We sat there too, strangers bound by proximity and rain, the air between us thick with unspoken things. He looked at me suddenly, eyes glinting in the candle light. You ever feel like life's just waiting for you to make one wrong move? All the time, I said. That got a smile out of him. Real one this time. Small but warm. You're easier to talk to than most people I know, he said. I think that's because I'm not part of your life, I replied quietly. It's easier to be honest with someone who doesn't expect anything. His expression softened. Yeah, maybe that's it. For a while neither of us spoke. The storm outside filled the silence for us. The hiss of rain, the rumble of thunder, the faint creak of the house breathing in the wind. Then lightning flashed again, bright, blinding, and for a second I saw him looking at me. Not the casual glance of a neighbor, not the friendly warmth from over the fence. Something raw, lonelier. The thunder followed loud, shaking the air. But neither of us flinched. The candles flickered violently, shadows dancing across the room. I could see the rise and fall of his chest, the droplets still clinging to his neck, the faint tremor in his hands. He spoke first, voice low. Shouldn't be here. I know, I said. Another silence, deep, electric. Then he leaned forward slightly. But I don't want to leave. My heart was a drum in my chest, each beat syncing with the rhythm of the rain. Michael, I started, but the word fell apart before I could finish. He didn't move closer. Not yet, but his eyes did, searching mine for something neither of us could name. And when the next lightning bolt flared through the window, we moved at the same time. Wasn't a decision. It wasn't planned. Was instinct. Two lonely souls colliding. In the space between fear and need. His lips met mine. Hesitant at first, then desperate. There was rain on his skin, salt on his mouth, the warmth of someone who hadn't been touched like this in too long. I felt the roughness of his hands as they found my shoulders, the shiver in his breath when he pulled back, uncertain, then leaned in again. Wasn't lust. It wasn't about wanting. Was about being seen, if only for a moment, about the ache of being forgotten by the people who were supposed to remember you. When he finally pulled away, we both sat frozen. The sound of rain filled the void. Sorry, he whispered, voice cracking. Don't know what I'm doing. I shook my head. You don't have to explain. He laughed softly, a broken sound. I think that's the problem. I've spent years not explaining. We sat there until the candles burned low, both staring at the same wall, both pretending we could undo what had just happened. Sometime in the early hours, the storm began to fade. The thunder grew distant. The rain softened into mist. Michael stood, rubbing his face with both hands. I should go, he said quietly. Stay until it's light, I offered, though I already knew he wouldn't. He looked at me, eyes tired, voice shaking. I can't. At the door he hesitated. The porch light across the yard had come back on, faint but steady. He glanced once over his shoulder. I'm sorry, he said again. Shouldn't have. Then he was gone, swallowed by the mist, footsteps fading into the wet pavement. I stood there, long after, listening to the hum of the refrigerator as the power flickered back. The faint buzz of life returning to normal, but it didn't feel normal. The air still held his scent. Rain and coffee and something human, fragile. Touched my lips once just to be sure it had happened. Outside, the storm had passed, but it left something behind, something I couldn't wash away. The storm passed, but its echo stayed. Every night after, the sound of rain on the roof dragged me back to that moment. The warmth of his breath, the way his voice cracked when he said, I'm sorry. Days turned into weeks. The sun came back. The lawns glistened green and ordinary again. But the fence between our houses stayed still. No laughter, no small talk, no clink of coffee mugs passed across the wood. Michael didn't come by anymore. The first few mornings, I caught myself glancing through the kitchen window, expecting to see him trimming the hedges or carrying his mug. I even watered my dying ferns just to have an excuse to be outside to listen for his voice. But the only sounds that came were birds and sprinklers mocking. How quiet the world could be. He avoided me carefully, deliberately. I catch glimpses sometimes, his truck pulling into the driveway, his silhouette passing by the window. Once I saw him take out the trash at dawn, moving like someone trying not to wake a sleeping world. Each sighting felt like a small moon. Proof he still existed, but somewhere I wasn't allowed to reach. Told myself I deserved it. The guilt came in waves. Some nights I replayed everything, wondering where the line had blurred. Was it when we started talking over the fence? When I let him fix the gutter? Or when I didn't pull away fast enough in the dark? I told myself he kissed me first, but that didn't matter. I didn't stop him. I'd known he was married. I'd known he was lonely. I'd known I was too. And loneliness is a dangerous kind of hunger. Weeks bled together. The house began to feel smaller. I stopped writing. Every time I opened my laptop, all that came out were fragments, half sentences, thoughts I couldn't finish. So I started writing by hand instead, in a notebook I kept tucked in a drawer. Not stories, not essays, just letters. Letters to him. Never signed them, never dated them. Just poured everything I couldn't say across the fence onto paper. You said you felt invisible. I saw you. You said you missed being known. I still know the sound of your voice when you lie. You said you were sorry. I am too, but for different reasons. Some nights I'd tear the pages out and burn them in a candle flame, watching the edges curl into ash. Other nights I'd leave them folded inside the notebook, pressed flat like confessions between pages of a forgotten book. It didn't help. The ache stayed. One afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen, I found the jar of sugar sitting on the counter, still half full. The same one from that first night he came over laughing under the rain. Was such an ordinary thing, but it hit harder than any memory. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. The granules clumped together from humidity, small crystals sticking to the glass. Was proof that something had happened here. Something real, even if it couldn't survive daylight. I almost threw it out, but I couldn't. So I left it where it was, a quiet reminder of something irreversible. Around that time I started noticing his wife more. She left early most mornings, keys jangling, her hair tied back tight, her movements sharp. In the evenings she'd returned long after sunset. Head down. No light in the kitchen until late. Maybe she knew, maybe she didn't, but the air around their house had changed. Felt tense, brittle, like the pause before something breaks. Once I saw them in their driveway talking or trying to. From where I stood, their voices were too low to catch, but their gestures told the story. His shoulders slumped, her stiff arms folded across her chest. Then she turned away, got into her car, and drove off. He stayed there a while, hands on his knees, staring at the ground. I closed my blinds and told myself it wasn't my business, but my pulse didn't agree. Nights were the worst. Sometimes I'd sit outside with a drink, staring at the fence under the porch light, waiting for something that wouldn't happen. The wood looked different now, colder, emptier. Thought about knocking on his door more than once. But what would I say? I miss you. I'm sorry. I can't sleep because you won't look at me anymore. Every version sounded selfish. So I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, everything about him got louder. The sound of his laugh, the way his hand brushed mine when passing a mug, the way his eyes softened when he talked about the parts of himself he'd forgotten. Memory has a cruel way of sharpening what it can't give back. One night, close to midnight, I caught the faint flicker of headlights through my blinds. A car parked in front of my house. Familiar shape, familiar dent in the rear bumper. His truck froze, standing just far enough from the window to stay hidden. The engine idled for a moment, then went quiet. He sat there motionless. The street was empty, the rain just beginning to fall again, faint and rhythmic. I could see him through the windshield, head bowed, shoulders heavy. Even from a distance I could tell his eyes were red. Whether from crying or exhaustion, I didn't know. For a full minute I didn't breathe. Part of me wanted to go out there, to knock on the window, to ask if he was okay, to say all the things neither of us had been brave enough to. But another part of me, the part that knew what this had already cost him, stayed still. I watched as he finally started the engine again. The headlights washed over my porch for a second before he pulled away, slow and unsteady, disappearing into the night. When the sound of his truck faded, the silence that followed was unbearable. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm grow heavier outside. There are some distances I realize that no amount of courage can cross. They're not measured in miles or fences or walls. They're measured in shame. And the worst part, I built mine myself. It had been nearly a month since I last saw him. The neighborhood moved on as if nothing had happened. Lawns trimmed, kids biking down the street, life carrying on in its quiet suburban rhythm. But I hadn't moved on. Not really. Then one overcast Saturday afternoon, I went to the grocery store. A simple errand that suddenly felt too heavy. The parking lot shimmered with heat after a brief drizzle. The air, thick with humidity, was loading a bag of groceries into the back seat when I heard a familiar sound. The low rumble of his truck engine froze. When I turned, there he was, Michael, stepping out of his truck a few spaces away. He looked thinner, older. Somehow, his shirt hung a little loose. His face pale beneath the gray sky, the kind of exhaustion you don't get from lack of sleep but from carrying too much for too long. Our eyes met across the asphalt. For a moment, the world went still. No engines, no footsteps, no sound but the slow thud of my heart. It hesitated, one hand on the door, then closed it quietly and walked toward me. "Hey," he said softly. I swallowed hard. He looked down, then up again, his voice unsteady. "Can we talk?" It wasn't a question that needed an answer. I just nodded. He gestured toward his truck. "Please." We sat inside. The air thick and unmoving. The faint scent of rain and stale coffee lingered in the cab. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers tapping nervously, the gold ring on his finger gone. He took a breath, deep and shaky. "I didn't plan to see you today," he said. "But maybe it's better this way." I said nothing, afraid that if I spoke, everything I'd been holding back would spill out all at once. He looked straight ahead, eyes fixed on nothing. "My marriage is over." The words landed like distant thunder. Not loud but impossible to ignore. "It found out," he continued quietly. "Or maybe she always knew. Not about you. Specifically, just about me." "About what?" "I've been hiding from her, from myself." I watched him struggle for the right words, his voice cracking around the edges. "I've been staying with a friend, trying to figure things out. She told me to take whatever time I needed." He gave a short, hollow laugh. "Guess she didn't mean forever." I wanted to reach for him, but my hand stayed in my lap. "Sorry," I said finally. "That must have been hard." He nodded. "Yeah, hard, but maybe necessary." Rain began again, tapping lightly against the windshield. A sound too gentle for everything it carried. "I keep thinking about that night," he said. "About the storm, about..." My throat tightened. "Me?" He turned to me, then really turned. And for the first time I saw it. The guilt, the exhaustion, but also something else. Relief. "I didn't come to borrow sugar that night," he said quietly. "I came because I didn't want to go home." The silence that followed was heavy, almost holy. I knew exactly what I was doing. He went on, standing there, pretending I needed something simple, but what I really wanted was to not feel alone for a few hours. He laughed weakly, rubbing his hands together. "I thought I could borrow a little comfort and leave it behind when I went home, but I couldn't." He got under my skin, into my head, into everything. The words cut deep, not because they hurt, but because they were true. I looked down at my hands, fingers trembling. "I think about you every day," I admitted. I tried not to. I told myself it was just one night, but it wasn't, was it? He shook his head, slowly. "No, it wasn't." The rain grew steadier, painting thin rivers down the blast. He leaned back against the seat, exhaling hard. "I've spent weeks trying to hate myself for it, for crossing that line, for what it cost her. But I can't regret it. Not completely, because it reminded me I'm still capable of feeling something real." I finally looked at him. Really looked. The stubble on his jaw, the veins in his hands, the faint crease between his brows that deepened when he Was thinking too hard. You don't have to justify it to me, I said softly. He turned toward me, eyes wet but steady. I'm not. I just needed you to know it. Wasn't about escape. It was about finding a piece of myself I'd lost a long time ago. Something inside me cracked. I reached out without thinking, laying my hand gently over his. It didn't pull away. His skin was cold, trembling slightly, but he gripped my fingers like he needed the reminder that he was still here, still real. No words passed between us for a long time. Outside, people came and went, pushing carts, carrying bags, oblivious to the small storm unfolding inside the parked truck. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low. I'm sorry for disappearing. I didn't know how to face you. Every time I thought about coming over, I'd freeze, because I didn't know what I wanted you to say. I wouldn't have asked for anything, I said. I know, he said softly. That's what made it harder. We both smiled, faint, sad human. The rain began to slow, the clouds thinning to pale silver. A single streak of sunlight broke through, cutting across the dashboard and catching the faint shimmer of his tears. He looked down at our joined hands, then at me. You don't owe me anything, I said. He gave a small nod, his lips parting in a whisper. Maybe not, but I still owe myself the truth. His hand tightened briefly around mine before letting go. And just like that, I knew our story had reached its quiet, inevitable turn. Not an ending, not yet, but the kind of pause that life gives before it starts again in a new direction. He turned the keys halfway, the engine humming softly. I'll be okay, he said almost to himself. I opened the door, stepping out into the damp air. I know, he gave me one last look, not pleading, not regretful, just honest, and then smiled, the smallest smile I'd ever seen. The kind that meant thank you, even if the words never came. As I walked away, I heard the engine start fully. I didn't turn around. The sound of tires on wet pavement faded behind me, replaced by the slow rhythm of my own footsteps and the quiet realization that some confessions aren't meant to heal. They're meant to free. And somehow that was enough. Months passed like a slow exhale. The summer heat faded into early autumn, and the air carried that quiet chill that makes everything feel new again. The maples along our street began to turn amber, leaves scattering across the yards like forgotten letters. The neighborhood felt different now, quieter, softer. Or maybe I did. Michael's house had been repainted, the lawn trimmed, but it didn't hum with the same life anymore. I'd see the blinds half drawn, the porch light left on for no one. There was stillness there, the kind that comes after a long storm. Not ruin, just quiet. I'd spent the months learning how to live with that quiet. At first I tried to fill it, noise, errands, new routines. But eventually I stopped resisting and started writing again. Real writing, not freelance pieces, not filler words for clients, but stories that bled truth. I'd sit at my desk by the window and let the words find me. Sometimes they came easy. Sometimes they came with the ache of memory. I never used his name, but I didn't have to. Every story I wrote carried a trace of that night, of that borrowed sweetness, of the silence that followed. And in a strange way it helped. The pain didn't vanish, but it became something else. Something bearable, something honest. One afternoon in late November, while I was raking leaves, I saw a moving truck down the street. First, I didn't think much of it until I saw him, Michael. He stood by the back of the truck, lifting boxes out with quiet focus, dressed in a worn jacket and jeans. There was no ring on his hand, no tension in his shoulders, just a calm kind of exhaustion, the look of a man who's rebuilding from the ground up. For a moment I froze. The rake slipped from my hand, hitting the ground with a dull thud. He looked up. Our eyes met across the distance, and time folded in on itself. The last time we'd spoken it had been in the rain. Now sunlight caught the corner of his face, turning the moment strangely gentle. He gave me a small, genuine smile. No wave, no words, just that look, a quiet acknowledgement of everything we'd been through and everything we'd survived. I smiled back, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, I'd see him, sometimes walking to the corner store, sitting on his new porch with a book, talking to neighbors like he belonged here again. Not as someone hiding, but as someone starting over. It didn't hurt to see him anymore. Not the way it used. Instead, it felt like watching a chapter close. One I had loved deeply, but knew better than to reopen. Life as it always does began to settle. Filled my days with words quiet. Mornings and small rituals. Coffee at sunrise, evening walks when the air turned gold. I learned to enjoy being alone again, not as a punishment but as a kind of freedom. Sometimes though I'd catch myself glancing toward his new place, half expecting to see him appear on the sidewalk. Old habits die slowly, especially the ones built on hope. Then, one mild afternoon in early spring, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find him standing there. Not in rain, not trembling, not lost, just Michael. He held out a small cup with a grin that reached his eyes this time. Thought I'd return what I borrowed, he said. Inside the cup, sugar for a second. I just stared at it, then laughed. Really? Laughed. You remembered? He shrugged, that familiar, boyish gesture still in him. Took me long enough. Come in, I said, stepping aside. The air inside smelled of coffee and faint vanilla from a candle I'd forgotten to blow out. He glanced around, smiling faintly. Looks different, he said. Feels different, I replied. We sat at the table, 2 mugs between us, the afternoon light stretching across the floor. Conversation came easy, gentle, ordinary. We talked about small things. His new job managing a local hardware branch, the quiet of his apartment, my writing, the tomatoes that somehow survived another winter. No heavy silences, no ghosts of the storm, just 2 people learning how to exist again, without the weight of what if. At one point he said, I never thank you for what? For listening. For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Looked down at my mug, watching the ripples fade. You didn't owe me that. Maybe not, he said softly. But I owe it to the person I was then to know that I wasn't invisible after all. He smiled again, and there was peace in it this time. Not longing, not guilt, just quiet acceptance. We finished our coffee, talking about nothing and everything. When he stood to leave, he said, I'll bring the cup back soon. I smiled. No rush. I've learned you can take your time. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that filled the room without echoing regret, and stepped into the sunlight. That night I sat at my desk again, the sugar cup beside me, half empty, half full. I wasn't sure which. The words came easily. I wrote about borrowed things. Time, forgiveness, love that didn't last but still mattered, about how some people come into your life not to stay but to wake something sleeping inside you. And as I wrote, I realized something simple and true. I wasn't waiting for him anymore. I wasn't waiting for anyone, but I was grateful for the storm, the silence, and everything between. He came to borrow sugar once, and for a while he borrowed me too. But what he left behind wasn't lost. It was proof that connection, even brief, even broken, can still mean something. I closed my notebook. The night air drifting through the window, soft and cool. Outside, the street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a light flickered on in his apartment. I smiled to myself, sipping the last of my coffee, and whispered the line that had lived in my chest since the beginning. Truth now gentle instead of aching. We thought it was just one night, but some tastes don't fade.